The words that came from that 9-year-old girl's mouth that gray November morning in Dublin's Four Courts would echo through every corner of Ireland for years to come. "Let my dog go free, and Our Lady of Knock will make ye walk again, Judge." The courtroom went dead silent for what felt like an eternity, then erupted in the most cruel laughter you've ever heard. They laughed at her worn school uniform, at her tiny voice trying to challenge the most ruthless judge in all of Ireland, at the very notion that a child could stand before the bench and make such an outrageous claim. But Judge Seamus O'Sullivan didn't laugh. Not because he believed in miracles, mind you, but because something in that little girl's eyes made him pause for the first time in 18 long years. This is the story of how one child's unshakable faith in Our Lady of Knock changed the course of justice forever in Ireland, and how a miracle witnessed by hundreds would spread like wildfire across every county from Cork to Donegal. But before we dive deeper into this extraordinary tale, I'd love for you to drop a comment below telling me which county you're watching from and what drew you to this story today. It warms my heart to see how far Our Lady's love reaches across our beautiful island. On that dreary morning in Dublin, Judge Seamus O'Sullivan sat behind his imposing bench like a fortress of stone. At 58 years old, confined to his wheelchair for nearly 2 decades, he had earned a reputation that struck fear into the hearts of every solicitor and barrister in Ireland. They called him the Iron Judge of Dublin, and for good reason. His conviction rate was a staggering 93%, with sentences so harsh that even hardened criminals would weep upon hearing his name assigned to their cases. But Seamus O'Sullivan hadn't always been this way. 18 years earlier, he had been Ireland's rising star in the legal world, a man who believed passionately that justice should be tempered with mercy. He was known for his fairness, his compassion, and his genuine desire to rehabilitate rather than simply punish. He had everything a man could want: a thriving career, a loving wife named Bridget, and dreams of starting a family together. That all changed on a rain-soaked night in County Wicklow when his car hit a patch of black ice on the N11, sending him careening into a stone wall that had stood for centuries. The crash left him paralyzed from the waist down, but the real damage went far deeper than his shattered spine. Bridget tried desperately to hold their marriage together, spending 3 agonizing years watching the man she loved disappear behind walls of bitterness and rage. The Seamus she had married was gone, replaced by a stranger who pushed away every kindness, every gesture of love, every attempt to reach the good man she knew still lived somewhere inside. When she finally couldn't take any more, Bridget packed her bags and moved to America, leaving behind a letter that simply said, "I'll always love the man you were, but I can't watch you destroy yourself any longer." That was the final blow that turned Seamus O'Sullivan's heart to stone. In his sparse flat overlooking the River Liffey, surrounded by nothing but law books and the mechanical routine that had become his existence, Judge O'Sullivan built his reputation as the most feared man in Irish courts. He showed no mercy because he believed he had received none from life itself. Defense attorneys would pray their cases wouldn't land on his docket. Families would break down crying when they heard his name. In 18 years on the bench, he had never once reduced a sentence, never once showed an ounce of compassion, never once allowed his personal feelings to interfere with what he saw as the cold, hard application of the law. But on this particular November morning, everything was about to change because of a family from the small town of Athlone whose lives had been turned upside down by an accusation that would test every fiber of their faith. Paddy Flanagan was 42 years old and had spent the last 23 years working as a mechanic in his small garage on the outskirts of town. He was a man of few words but many skills, known throughout County Westmeath for his honest dealing and his willingness to help anyone in need, often fixing cars for widows and pensioners without charging a penny. His wife Siobhan had passed away 4 years earlier from cancer, leaving him to raise their daughter Aisling on his own. 9-year-old Aisling was the light of her father's life, a bright, spirited girl with hair as red as autumn leaves and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. Since her mother's death, she had developed an extraordinary devotion to Our Lady of Knock, praying the rosary every single night with the same worn beads that had belonged to her grandmother. Their small house was filled with Aisling's drawings and school certificates, and on her bedside table sat a statue of Our Lady of Knock, that Siobhan had given her shortly before she died. Every evening, Aisling would kneel beside her bed and ask Our Lady to watch over her doll and to help anyone in the world who was suffering. The Flanagans lived a simple life, but it was rich with love and faith. Paddy worked hard to provide for his daughter, making sure she never wanted for anything important, though money was often tight. The people of Athlone respected Paddy as a man of integrity who had never so much as taken a paperclip that didn't belong to him. Aisling was beloved by her teachers and classmates alike, always ready with a helping hand and never boasting about her excellent marks. She spent her free time helping at the local church and visiting elderly neighbors who lived alone. They were the kind of family that made their community stronger simply by being part of it. But in October of 2019, their peaceful world was shattered when Paddy was accused of stealing expensive tools from the construction site where he occasionally did contract work. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Security cameras showing a man matching Paddy's description, witnesses placing him at the scene during the time of the theft, and most damning of all, some of the stolen tools found hidden in his garage during a police search. To anyone looking at the case from the outside, Paddy Flanagan appeared guilty as sin. But for those who truly knew Paddy Flanagan, the very idea was laughable. This was a man who had once driven 15 miles out of his way to return a wallet he found with just 20 euros inside. A man who refused to charge extra for emergency repairs, even when it meant working through the night. A man who taught his daughter that taking something that wasn't yours was one of the worst sins imaginable. Yet here he was, sitting in a cold cell in Mountjoy prison, charged with theft and facing years behind bars that would separate him from the only family he had left in this world. Liam Murphy, a hard-working solicitor from Dublin, took on Paddy's case. Murphy had built his reputation defending working-class families who couldn't afford the expensive barristers, and something about the Flanagan case bothered him deeply. When he visited Paddy in prison, he found a man who was utterly broken, not by guilt, but by the sheer impossibility of proving his innocence against such seemingly solid evidence. "I swear on my dear wife Siobhan's grave," Paddy told him, his voice cracking with emotion. "I never took so much as a screwdriver that wasn't mine. My little Aisling has already lost her ma'am. She can't lose her da too, Mr. Murphy. She just can't." Murphy believed him completely, but believing and proving are two very different things in a court of law. The evidence was too neat, too perfect, almost as if someone had wanted Paddy to be caught. The solicitor began digging deeper, spending his own money to hire a private investigator, following leads that seemed to go nowhere, desperately searching for the truth that he knew was hidden somewhere beneath all the manufactured evidence. What he didn't know was that the real culprit was someone much closer to home than anyone could have imagined. While Paddy sat in his cell, young Aisling was living through every parent's worst nightmare and every child's deepest fear. Mrs. Teresa O'Brien, an elderly neighbor who had known the family for years, took Aisling into her home, but nothing could ease the little girl's heartbreak. She cried herself to sleep every night, calling out for her da, unable to understand how the world could be so cruel to a man who had never hurt anyone. At school, she couldn't concentrate on her lessons, her bright mind consumed with worry and confusion. Her teachers tried their best to comfort her, but what comfort could they offer when everyone in town was talking about her father's supposed crime? Every single night, without fail, Aisling would kneel beside her borrowed bed, clutching her grandmother's worn rosary beads, and pour her heart out to Our Lady of Knock. She had learned about the miraculous apparition from her mother, about how Our Lady had appeared to 15 witnesses in that small Mayo village, bringing hope and healing to people who desperately needed both. "Please, Our Lady," she would whisper through her tears. "You know my da didn't steal anything. You know he's a good man who only ever tried to help people. Please help them see the truth before it's too late." But Aisling didn't just pray for her father's freedom. In her pure, innocent heart, she also prayed for the judge who would decide his fate, even though she had never seen him or knew anything about him beyond his fearsome reputation. "Our Lady of Knock," she would continue her nightly prayers. "If the judge's heart is hard, please soften it. If he's been hurt, please heal him. If he can't see clearly, please open his eyes to what's really happening." It was this extraordinary combination of faith and compassion that would soon create one of the most remarkable scenes ever witnessed in an Irish courtroom. A moment that would be talked about in pubs and parishes across the country for generations to come. The investigation into Paddy's case was moving forward, but far too slowly for anyone's comfort. Liam Murphy had discovered some troubling inconsistencies in the evidence, small details that didn't quite add up, but nothing concrete enough to build a defense on. The security footage was grainy and unclear, taken from a distance that made positive identification nearly impossible. The witnesses seemed honest enough, but Murphy noticed that their descriptions of the thief varied significantly when he interviewed them separately. Most puzzling of all was the discovery of the stolen tools in Paddy's garage. The lock on his garage door showed signs of being picked, something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Murphy hired a locksmith to examine the door, and the expert confirmed his suspicions. "This lock was definitely picked, no question about it," the locksmith told him. "Whoever did it knew what they were doing, but they left clear tool marks. This door was opened from the outside by someone who didn't have a key." This was the first real breakthrough in the case. But Murphy knew it wouldn't be enough to convince a jury, especially not with Judge O'Sullivan presiding. He had heard the stories about the Iron Judge, about his complete lack of mercy, about his 93% conviction rate. Murphy had never appeared before O'Sullivan, but every solicitor in Dublin knew that getting your case assigned to his courtroom was like receiving a death sentence for your client. The prosecution's case was being handled by senior counsel Marcus Byrne, a man who treated every trial like a personal crusade and every defendant like a sworn enemy. Byrne had earned his reputation by being ruthless in his pursuit of convictions, caring more about his win-loss record than about justice or truth. He looked at the Flanagan case and saw an easy victory, a simple theft case with overwhelming evidence and a defendant who couldn't afford top-tier representation. For Byrne, this was just another stepping stone in his climb toward becoming Ireland's youngest senior counsel to reach 100 convictions. As the trial date approached, the entire town of Athlone seemed to be holding its breath. Paddy Flanagan had lived there his entire life. He had fixed cars for their families, helped them through tough times, been a shoulder to lean on when life got difficult. The idea that this gentle, honest man could be a thief seemed impossible to most of them, yet the evidence was undeniably strong. Many of his friends and neighbors planned to attend the trial in Dublin, hoping their presence might somehow help. Though they knew that Judge O'Sullivan wasn't known for being swayed by public opinion or character testimony, the night before the trial, Aisling couldn't sleep at all. She spent hours on her knees beside her bed, praying with an intensity that moved Mrs. O'Brien to tears. The elderly woman found her at 3 in the morning, still clutching her rosary, still whispering prayers to Our Lady of Knock. "My dear child," Mrs. O'Brien said gently, "you need to rest. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." But Aisling looked up at her with eyes far too wise for her 9 years and asked a question that would haunt the old woman for the rest of her life. "Mrs. O'Brien, do you believe Our Lady of Knock still performs miracles?" The elderly woman, who had been making pilgrimages to Knock for over 40 years, felt her heart break a little as she answered, "Yes, dear one. I believe she can still work miracles when we need them most." Aisling smiled for the first time in weeks and said something that would prove to be prophetic. "Then, I'm going to ask her for the biggest miracle anyone has ever seen. I'm going to ask her to save my da and heal whoever needs healing most." On the morning of November 15th, the four courts in Dublin was buzzing with more activity than usual. Word had spread throughout the legal community about the Flanagan case, not because it was particularly complex, but because everyone was curious to see Judge O'Sullivan in action. Young barristers came to observe his legendary courtroom presence. Journalists positioned themselves in the gallery hoping to witness another of his notorious harsh sentences. And a group of supporters from Athlone filled several rows, their presence a testament to their belief in Paddy's innocence, despite all evidence to the contrary. Aisling arrived holding Mrs. O'Brien's hand, wearing her best dress, a beautiful shade of blue that reminded everyone who saw it of the traditional color associated with Our Lady. In her small school bag, she carried her mother's rosary and a small prayer card featuring an image of Our Lady of Knock that had been blessed. by a priest during their last family pilgrimage to Mayo. When she saw her father being led into the dock by the guards, Iceling's heart nearly broke all over again. Paddy looked thin and tired, his usually strong shoulders stooped with worry. But when he spotted his daughter in the gallery, he managed a weak smile and mouthed the words, "I love you." The moment Judge Seamus O'Sullivan wheeled himself into the courtroom, the entire atmosphere changed. Every conversation stopped, every whisper died away, and a heavy silence settled over the room like a thick blanket. Even the most experienced barristers felt their heart's rate increase when they saw him. His steel-gray eyes scanning the crowd with the cold efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped seeing defendants as human beings worthy of compassion. His reputation preceded him into every room he entered, and today was no different. This was the judge who had never once reduced a sentence, who had never shown mercy, who treated the law like a mathematical equation with only one possible answer: guilt. Senior Counsel Byrne rose to present the prosecution's case with the confidence of a man who knew he was about to secure another easy victory. He laid out the evidence methodically and dramatically, painting Paddy as a desperate man who had turned to crime to support his family after his wife's death. The security footage, though grainy, clearly showed a man of Paddy's height and build in the area at the time of the theft. 3 witnesses placed him near the construction site that evening. Cell phone records proved he had been in the vicinity during the exact time frame when the tools went missing. And most damning of all, a significant portion of the stolen tools had been found hidden in his own garage, discovered during a lawful search of his property. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Byrne said with theatrical flair, "the evidence before you today is as clear as the morning sun over Dublin Bay. Patrick Flanagan is guilty of theft, pure and simple. The defense may try to convince you otherwise. They may appeal to your emotions with stories of hardship and single parenthood, but the facts speak for themselves. This man took tools that didn't belong to him, hid them in his garage, and would have sold them if he hadn't been caught. The law is clear on such matters, and justice demands that he pay the full price for his crimes." When Byrne finished his presentation, the courtroom was filled with a heavy certainty that Paddy Flanagan would be spending the next several years in prison, separated from his daughter when she needed him most. Liam Murphy did his absolute best with the defense, but he was fighting an uphill battle against seemingly insurmountable evidence. He questioned the quality of the security footage, pointing out that the images were too unclear to make a positive identification. He challenged the reliability of the witnesses, showing that their descriptions of the alleged thief contained significant inconsistencies when examined closely. He presented evidence about the picked lock on Paddy's garage, suggesting that someone else had planted the stolen tools there to frame an innocent man. He brought in character witnesses from Athlone who testified to Paddy's honesty, his reputation for helping others, his dedication to his daughter, and his complete lack of any criminal history. But Murphy could feel the case slipping away from him with every passing minute. The evidence was simply too strong, too comprehensive, too perfectly orchestrated. Judge O'Sullivan sat behind his bench like a statue of cold justice, his face showing no emotion whatsoever as the testimony unfolded. Murphy had hoped to see some flicker of doubt in the judge's eyes, some small sign that his arguments were having an effect, but there was nothing. The Iron Judge lived up to his reputation completely, showing no more warmth than a block of granite. When Murphy finished his closing argument, making one last desperate appeal for reasonable doubt, he knew in his heart that he had failed to save an innocent man from a terrible fate. Senior Counsel Byrne's closing argument was a masterpiece of legal rhetoric, delivered with the passion of a man who genuinely believed he was serving justice. He systematically destroyed every argument the defense had raised, explaining away each piece of contradictory evidence with logic that seemed unshakable. "The defense wants you to believe in an elaborate conspiracy," he told the jury, "a complex plot involving multiple people working together to frame one innocent mechanic from Athlone. But the truth is much simpler than that. Patrick Flanagan needed money, he saw an opportunity, and he took it. The evidence proves his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt, and your duty as jurors is to find him guilty as charged." Judge O'Sullivan adjusted his reading glasses and reached for the papers that would seal Paddy Flanagan's fate. His voice, when he began to speak, cut through the courtroom air like a blade through silk. "Patrick Flanagan," he began in his famously cold tone, "having carefully considered all the evidence presented in this case, having weighed the testimony of the witnesses, and having examined the physical evidence discovered at your residence, this court finds that the prosecution has proven beyond reasonable doubt that you are—" But he never finished that sentence, because at that exact moment, something happened that no one in that courtroom would ever forget for the rest of their lives. "Wait, please!" The thin but determined voice of 9-year-old Aisling Flanagan pierced through the formal proceedings like lightning splitting the night sky. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the gallery, where the little girl was rising from her seat, her bright blue dress making her look like a tiny angel standing among a sea of dark suits and worried faces. Mrs. O'Brien reached out to stop her, but Aisling was already moving, walking down the aisle toward the front of the courtroom with steps that seemed far too confident for someone so young. The murmur that swept through the courtroom was unlike anything anyone had ever heard in that sacred hall of justice. Experienced barristers looked at each other in shock, journalists fumbled for their pens, and the supporters from Athlone watched in amazement as the little girl they had all watched grow up prepared to challenge the most feared judge in all of Ireland. Judge O'Sullivan's frown deepened into something that looked almost dangerous, his eyes narrowing as he watched this unprecedented interruption of his courtroom proceedings. Aisling walked straight to the center of the courtroom and stopped directly in front of the raised bench where Judge O'Sullivan sat like a king on his throne, looking down at her with barely controlled irritation. Despite her young age, despite the enormous pressure of the moment, despite the hundreds of eyes staring at her from every corner of the room, Aisling Flanagan stood tall and spoke with a clarity that surprised everyone present. "I'm Aisling Flanagan," she announced, her voice carrying much farther than anyone would have expected, "and I'm here to speak for my da before you make a terrible mistake that will hurt everyone in this room." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers and nervous laughter, but Judge O'Sullivan raised his hand for silence, his curiosity apparently overcoming his annoyance at this highly irregular interruption. "Child," he said in a voice that could freeze fire, "this is a court of law, not a playground. You have no business interrupting these proceedings." But Aisling didn't back down, didn't show even a hint of the fear that any reasonable person would feel when facing down the Iron Judge of Dublin. Instead, she looked directly into his cold gray eyes and said something that would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. "I know what justice really means, Your Honor. My ma'am taught me before Our Lady called her home. Justice means finding the truth, even when people try to hide it. Justice means protecting innocent people from lies. And justice means having the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard." For what felt like an eternity, Judge Seamus O'Sullivan sat in complete silence, staring at this remarkable child who had just defined justice better than most law professors could manage. There was something in her unwavering gaze, something in her absolute conviction, that reminded him of feelings he had buried so deeply that he thought they were gone forever. Against every instinct, against 18 years of cold professionalism, against his better judgment, he heard himself saying, "You have 2 minutes. Make them count." Aisling nodded gratefully and did something that would be remembered and retold in Irish pubs and homes for generations to come. She opened her small school bag and carefully removed her mother's rosary, the worn wooden beads that had been passed down through 3 generations of faithful Irish women. She held the rosary in her small hands like it was the most precious treasure in the world, and in a voice that trembled slightly but never wavered, she made a promise that would change everything. "Your Honor, my da never stole those tools, and Our Lady of Knock is going to prove it to you. But more than that, if you let my da go free, Our Lady of Knock will heal your legs and make you walk again." The courtroom literally exploded. Laughter erupted from every corner of the room, cruel and mocking and filled with disbelief. Some people pointed at the little girl and whispered among themselves about her obvious desperation. Others shook their heads in pity, thinking she had lost her mind under the pressure of her father's trial. A few even applauded sarcastically, treating her promise like some sort of entertainment. "The poor child has completely lost it," someone said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Someone needs to get her out of here before she embarrasses herself even more," added another voice from the gallery. But Aisling Flanagan, 9 years old and wearing her mother's favorite shade of blue, didn't flinch at the mockery. She didn't run away or break down in tears like most children would have done. Instead, she did something that silenced the laughter and sent chills down the spine of everyone present. She knelt right there in the middle of the courtroom, in front of hundreds of people who were laughing at her faith, and began to pray the rosary out loud in a voice that carried to every corner of that sacred hall of justice. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee," she began, her clear young voice cutting through the cruel laughter like a sword of pure faith. Some people laughed even harder, but others began to fall silent, touched by something they couldn't quite explain about the sight of this innocent child kneeling in prayer while the adult world mocked her beliefs. "Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus," Aisling continued, and with each word, more of the laughter died away, replaced by something that felt almost like reverence. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen." As she finished the first Hail Mary and began the second, something extraordinary began happening to Judge Seamus O'Sullivan, something that defied every law of medicine and every principle of science that he had ever learned. At first, it was just the faintest tingling sensation in his right leg, so subtle that he initially dismissed it as nothing more than his imagination, perhaps some sort of psychosomatic response to this bizarre and emotionally charged scene unfolding in his courtroom. But the sensation grew stronger, spreading from his toes up through his calf like warm electricity flowing through dead wires. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in 18 long years, not since that terrible night when his car hit the ice and changed his life forever. Judge O'Sullivan gripped the arms of his wheelchair so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his heart beginning to race as impossible sensations coursed through limbs that had been completely dead for nearly 2 decades. "This isn't happening," he thought desperately. "It's psychological. Just some sort of strange emotional reaction to this unusual situation." But the feelings in his legs continued to intensify with each word of Aisling's prayer. Dead nerves that had been silent for 18 years suddenly crackled with new life. Muscles that had atrophied from complete lack of use began receiving signals from his brain that should have been impossible. As Aisling began her third Hail Mary, still kneeling in the center of the courtroom while tears streamed down her face, Judge O'Sullivan felt his toes respond to the commands of his brain for the first time since his accident. It lasted only seconds, but it was absolutely undeniably real. The sensation in his legs grew stronger and more defined with each passing moment of the little girl's prayer. Judge O'Sullivan tried desperately to maintain his composure, to keep the iron mask of indifference that had protected him for so many years, but inside he was in complete panic. Spinal cord injuries didn't heal themselves. Paralyzed legs didn't suddenly start working again. The doctors had been absolutely clear about that 18 years ago, and nothing had changed since then. Yet here he was, feeling sensations in his legs that were growing stronger by the minute, all while a 9-year-old girl prayed to Our Lady of Knock for a miracle that everyone in the room considered impossible. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee," Aisling continued, her faith so pure and absolute that it seemed to create an invisible field of divine energy around her small, kneeling form. Judge O'Sullivan tried to move his feet against the footrests of his wheelchair, and for one terrifying, wonderful, impossible moment, they responded completely. Not just tingling or vague sensations, but full control, full feeling, full movement. For approximately 10 seconds, Judge Seamus O'Sullivan could feel and control his legs, as if the last 18 years had never happened. The judge let out a strangled cry and doubled over in his wheelchair, his hands shaking uncontrollably as the impossible sensations in his legs reached a crescendo before fading back to the familiar nothingness he had known for so long. But those 10 seconds had been absolutely real, and the memory of them burned in his mind like a fire that could never be extinguished. Every person in the courtroom stopped what they were doing and stared at the most feared judge in Ireland as he struggled to regain his composure, clearly shaken by something profound and unexplainable. "Your Honor, are you all right?" asked the court clerk, genuine concern replacing the usual fear in his voice. Aisling stopped praying and looked up at Judge O'Sullivan with eyes full of hope and compassion, somehow knowing that something miraculous had just occurred. The judge tried to speak, tried to restore order to his courtroom, tried to return to the cold professionalism that had defined his career. But his voice came out as barely a whisper. "This court is adjourned until further notice." As the gavel fell from his trembling hand and clattered to the floor, Judge Seamus O'Sullivan knew that his life had just changed forever, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Within hours of that dramatic courtroom scene, two parallel investigations were racing toward conclusions that would shake the very foundations of the Irish legal system. Judge O'Sullivan, still reeling from the impossible sensations he had experienced during Aisling's prayer, immediately contacted his longtime physician, Dr. Fiona McCarthy, demanding emergency tests that might explain what had happened to him in that courtroom. "Seamus, you were just examined 6 months ago," Dr. McCarthy reminded him when he called her that afternoon, his voice still shaking with emotion. "All your tests were completely normal, which in your case means no change from the complete paralysis you've lived with for 18 years. But Judge O'Sullivan wouldn't be deterred. "Something happened today, Fiona. I felt my legs." I moved my feet. "For nearly 10 seconds, I had complete sensation and control. I need to know what's happening to me, and I need to know now." Dr. McCarthy, who had been treating spinal cord injuries for over 20 years, had never heard of such a thing happening to a patient with O'Sullivan's type of complete injury, but she agreed to see him immediately. Meanwhile, Liam Murphy was conducting his own investigation into the evidence against Paddy Flanagan, driven by a growing suspicion that his client was the victim of an elaborate frame-up. The private investigator he had hired, a sharp woman named Detective Inspector Sarah Kelly, who had recently retired from the Gardaí, had been quietly following leads that the original investigation had missed completely. Detective Inspector Kelly had discovered several troubling inconsistencies in the case against Paddy Flanagan. The security camera that had allegedly captured him near the construction site had been installed just 2 weeks before the theft, and the company that installed it had no record of who had ordered and paid for the work. The witnesses who claimed to have seen Paddy in the area all lived in the same apartment building and had all been interviewed by the same Garda officer, who happened to be the cousin of someone with a very good reason to want Paddy Flanagan out of the way. That someone was Connor Walsh, a mechanic from a rival garage in Athlone who had been losing customers to Paddy for years. Walsh had debts that were spiraling out of control, a gambling problem that had cost him his house, and a growing resentment toward the man whose honest reputation was making his own dishonest practices look even worse by comparison. Detective Inspector Kelly discovered that Walsh bore a striking resemblance to Paddy Flanagan, enough that they could easily be mistaken for each other in poor lighting or grainy security footage. But the most damning evidence came when Kelly examined the lock on Paddy's garage door with the help of a professional locksmith who specialized in forensic analysis. Not only had the lock been picked by someone with considerable skill, but microscopic analysis revealed metal shavings that didn't match any of Paddy's tools. These shavings were consistent with a specific type of lock-picking set that was sold by only one supplier in Dublin, and Detective Inspector Kelly was able to trace a recent purchase of such a set to someone using Connor Walsh's credit card. When confronted with this evidence, Walsh broke down completely. He confessed to stealing the tools from the construction site, breaking into Paddy's garage to plant some of them there, and paying his cousin to intimidate the witnesses into giving false testimony. He had been planning this frame-up for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy his rival's reputation and steal his customers. The confession was immediately sent to Liam Murphy, who rushed it to Judge O'Sullivan's chambers, along with all the supporting evidence that proved Paddy Flanagan's complete innocence. At the same time, Judge O'Sullivan was receiving news that should have been impossible. Dr. McCarthy had run every test available, including advanced MRI scans that showed his spinal cord in detail that hadn't been available 18 years earlier. "I don't know how to explain this to you, Seamus," she told him as they looked at the results together. Your original injury is still there, still complete, but there are signs of neurological activity that simply weren't present in any of your previous scans. It's as if your nervous system is trying to regenerate itself, which should be impossible given the nature and age of your injury. Judge O'Sullivan stared at the scans, seeing clear evidence of something that medical science said couldn't happen. New neural pathways were forming around his damaged spinal cord, creating connections that bypassed the site of his original injury. The activity was still minimal, but it was definitely there and it was definitely new. "What does this mean?" he asked, hardly daring to hope. "I honestly don't know," Dr. McCarthy replied. "I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of practice. If this neural regeneration continues, there's a possibility, just a possibility, that you might regain some function in your legs. But Seamus, I have to stress that this is completely unprecedented. I can't make any promises or predictions." When Judge O'Sullivan returned to court the following week to rule on the Flanagan case, he was a changed man in more ways than anyone could have imagined. The evidence of Connor Walsh's confession and the frame-up was overwhelming and undeniable. Rising from his wheelchair to address the packed courtroom, Judge O'Sullivan's voice carried a warmth that no one had heard from him in 18 years. After a complete review of new evidence that has come to light, including a full confession from the actual perpetrator of these crimes, this court finds Patrick Flanagan completely innocent of all charges. Mr. Flanagan, you are free to go, and this court extends its deepest apologies for the injustice you have suffered. The moment when Patty Flanagan was reunited with his daughter Aisling was one that brought tears to every eye in that courtroom. She ran into his arms with a joy that was absolutely infectious, and their embrace seemed to heal something broken in everyone who witnessed it. "I knew Our Lady would help us, Da," Aisling whispered as she hugged her father. "I knew she wouldn't let them hurt you." Patty held his daughter tight, overwhelmed with gratitude not just for his freedom, but for the extraordinary faith and courage his little girl had shown in their darkest hour. Judge O'Sullivan watched this reunion from his bench, feeling emotions he had thought were dead forever stirring back to life in his chest. But the changes in his own life were just beginning. Over the following months, the sensations in his legs continued to strengthen and expand. What had started as brief tinglings during Aisling's prayer gradually became longer periods of feeling and movement. 6 months after that extraordinary day in court, Judge O'Sullivan was able to move his toes and ankles for minutes at a time. A year later, he could feel and control his entire legs, though they were still too weak to support his weight. 18 months after 9-year-old Aisling Flanagan had knelt in his courtroom and promised that Our Lady of Knock would heal him, Judge Seamus O'Sullivan stood up from his wheelchair and took his first steps in nearly 2 decades. It happened on a quiet morning in his apartment, with no one there to witness it but himself. He had woken up feeling stronger than usual, and on an impulse that he couldn't explain, he had gripped the arms of his chair and tried to stand. To his amazement, his legs supported him, weak and shaky, but definitely functional. His first steps were tentative and unsteady, but they were steps nonetheless. He walked slowly to his window overlooking the Liffey, tears streaming down his face as he realized that the miracle Aisling had promised him had actually come true. The doctors called it unprecedented neurological regeneration. The newspapers called it a medical mystery, but Judge O'Sullivan knew exactly what it was. A miracle from Our Lady of Knock, granted through the pure faith of a 9-year-old girl who had believed when everyone else had laughed. The first person he wanted to tell was Aisling, so he drove himself to Athlone that very day. When Patty opened the door and saw Judge O'Sullivan standing there, leaning on a walking stick but clearly upright and mobile, the mechanic was speechless. "Aisling!" Patty called out, his voice filled with wonder. "Come here, love. You need to see this." When the little girl appeared and saw the judge standing at their door, her face lit up with a smile that could have powered the entire town of Athlone. "Judge O'Sullivan!" she exclaimed, running to give him a hug that nearly knocked him over. "Our Lady did it, didn't she?" "She kept her promise." The judge knelt down, something he never thought he'd be able to do again, and looked into the eyes of the remarkable child who had changed his life forever. "She did indeed, Aisling. And I need to thank you for having enough faith for both of us when I had none left." Aisling hugged him again and said, something that would become his guiding principle for the rest of his career: "You don't need to thank me, Judge. You just need to remember that everyone deserves a second chance, just like Our Lady gave you." Judge Seamus O'Sullivan returned to his courtroom a completely transformed man. Gone was the Iron Judge who showed no mercy. In his place stood a man who understood that justice without compassion was not justice at all, but merely vengeance dressed up in legal robes. His sentencing became known for its fairness, his courtroom for its humanity, and his reputation for treating every defendant as a human being worthy of dignity and respect. Young lawyers sought to appear before him, knowing they would get a fair hearing regardless of their experience or their client's circumstances. The story of what happened in that Dublin courtroom spread across Ireland like wildfire. Newspapers picked it up, radio stations discussed it, and before long, people throughout the country were talking about the little girl who had stood up to the Iron Judge and promised him a miracle from Our Lady of Knock. Pilgrims began making special trips to the shrine in Mayo, asking Our Lady to bless their own families with the same faith and courage that Aisling had shown. The story even reached Rome, where Vatican officials quietly began their own investigation into what many were calling a genuine miracle. Aisling Flanagan returned to her normal life in Athlone, but she was forever changed by her experience. She had learned that faith could move mountains, and that even the most powerful people in the world were still just human beings who needed love and healing. She continued her nightly prayers to Our Lady of Knock, but now she also prayed for Judge O'Sullivan and for all the other judges and lawyers and policemen who made decisions that affected people's lives. Her pure heart had taught her that everyone, no matter how scary or powerful they might seem, was someone's child who deserved compassion and understanding. Years later, when Aisling was old enough to truly understand what had happened in that courtroom, she would often be asked to speak at schools and churches about faith and courage. She would always tell her audiences the same thing: "Our Lady of Knock didn't perform a miracle because I was special or holy or better than anyone else. She performed a miracle because she loves all of us so much that she can't bear to see us suffer when we don't have to. All she needs from us is faith the size of a mustard seed and the courage to ask for what we need. The rest is up to her." The miracle at the Four Courts that November day became one of the most documented and investigated supernatural events in modern Irish history. Medical experts from around the world studied Judge O'Sullivan's case, trying to understand how complete spinal cord paralysis could reverse itself so dramatically and so completely. Religious scholars examined every aspect of Aisling's prayer and the circumstances surrounding it, looking for insights into the nature of divine intervention in human affairs. But perhaps the most important investigation was the one conducted by the people of Ireland themselves, as they reflected on what the story meant for their own lives and their own faith. What they found was a reminder of something they had always known, but sometimes forgotten: that Ireland was a land blessed by Our Lady, a country where the impossible had always been just a prayer away for those with enough faith to ask. The story of Aisling Flanagan and Judge O'Sullivan joined the great tradition of Irish saints and miracles, taking its place alongside the stories of St. Patrick and St. Bridget and all the other holy men and women who had shown that Ireland was truly a land where heaven touched earth on a regular basis. Today, if you visit Knock Shrine in County Mayo, you'll find a small plaque near the Apparition Chapel that tells the story of a 9-year-old girl from Athlone whose faith moved Our Lady to perform a miracle in a Dublin courtroom. Pilgrims from around the world come to pray at that shrine, many of them carrying their own impossible burdens, their own desperate needs, their own prayers for miracles that seem too big for even God to handle. But the story of Aisling reminds them that no prayer is too big for Our Lady of Knock, no situation too hopeless, no miracle too impossible when it's asked for with a pure heart and perfect faith. The transformation of Judge O'Sullivan became a beacon of hope for people throughout Ireland who had been hurt by life's cruelties and had allowed their hearts to grow cold. His story proved that it's never too late for redemption, never too late for healing, never too late for the love of Our Lady to break through the barriers we build around our wounded hearts. Lawyers and judges throughout the country began to look at their own practices, asking themselves whether they were serving justice or merely going through the motions of a legal system that had lost its way. Paddy Flanagan returned to his garage in Athlone with a reputation that was stronger than ever. Word of his ordeal and vindication spread throughout County Westmeath, and people came from miles around to have their cars fixed by the man who had been falsely accused, but had maintained his dignity and faith throughout the entire ordeal. His business thrived, but more importantly, his relationship with his daughter deepened into something beautiful and unbreakable. He often said that while he wouldn't wish the experience of being falsely imprisoned on anyone, he was grateful for what it had taught him about the power of faith and the importance of never giving up hope. Connor Walsh, the man who had orchestrated the frame-up, faced his own consequences for his crimes. He was sentenced to several years in prison for theft and perjury, but more importantly, he was forced to confront the jealousy and resentment that had led him to try to destroy an innocent man's life. During his time in prison, he attended chapel services regularly and eventually found his own path to redemption. Upon his release, he wrote a letter to Paddy Flanagan asking for forgiveness, a letter that Paddy answered with characteristic grace and compassion. The legal implications of the Flanagan case led to significant reforms in how evidence is collected and verified in Irish courts. Detective Inspector Kelly's investigation revealed weaknesses in the system that allowed fabricated evidence to go undetected for too long. New protocols were established to prevent similar frame-ups in the future, and her work on the case led to her being brought out of retirement to head a new unit dedicated to investigating wrongful convictions throughout Ireland. But beyond all the legal and medical and religious implications of what happened that day, the story of Aisling Flanagan and Judge O'Sullivan remains at its heart, a simple story about the power of love to transform even the hardest heart. It's about a little girl who saw past the fearsome reputation of the Iron Judge and recognized him for what he really was, a wounded man who needed healing. It's about the courage to stand up for truth even when everyone around you is laughing. It's about the faith to ask for the impossible and the love to pray for your enemies as well as your friends. The miracle at the Four Courts reminds us that Our Lady of Knock is still watching over Ireland, still ready to intervene in our lives when we need her most, still willing to work through the faith of a child to bring about changes that no adult could have imagined. It challenges us to examine our own hearts and ask ourselves whether we have the kind of faith that can move mountains, the kind of love that can see past appearances to the wounded soul beneath, the kind of courage to speak truth to power even when we're afraid. As you reflect on this extraordinary story, I invite you to consider what miracles you might be preventing in your own life simply by not having the faith to ask for them. Our Lady of Knock performed an incredible miracle in that Dublin courtroom, but she performs smaller miracles every day for those who approach her with pure hearts and genuine faith. Perhaps the healing you need, the breakthrough you're hoping for, the change you've been praying about is just one sincere prayer away. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Has this story strengthened your own faith in Our Lady of Knock? Have you experienced your own miracles, large or small, that you'd be willing to share with our community? Sometimes the most powerful testimonies come not from dramatic healings in courtrooms, but from the quiet ways Our Lady works in our daily lives. Healing broken relationships, opening closed doors, bringing peace to troubled hearts, and reminding us that we are never alone in our struggles. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel if this story has touched your heart, because there are so many more stories of faith, hope, and miracles waiting to be shared. Every subscription helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages of hope, and every comment you leave creates a community of faith that supports and encourages others who are facing their own impossible situations. Share this video with anyone you know who needs to be reminded of the power of faith and the love of Our Lady. Sometimes, a single story like this one can change someone's entire perspective on what's possible in their own life. Write in the comments what you learned from Aisling's courage, or how Judge O'Sullivan's transformation has inspired you to look at your own hardened places that might need Our Lady's healing touch. Let's create a chain of prayer and testimony that reaches across Ireland and beyond, connecting all of us who believe in the miraculous love of Our Lady of Knock. Together, our faith can move mountains, heal the brokenhearted, and remind the world that miracles still happen for those who dare to believe.